Good morning from Barcelona, Spain. I'm Alex Williams, founder editor-in-chief of the New Stack, and this is our New Stack Analyst Show. And today I am joined by the press corps from KubeCon. Frederic Lardinois, writer and news editor at TechCrunch. Hello, Frederic. Ron Miller, enterprise reporter at TechCrunch, and Sean Michael Kerner, senior editor at internetnews.com.
Morning.
Good morning.
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 So there's a lot to go through here, and perhaps we would start with just looking at some of the major news that you saw coming out of the show. From my opinion, there wasn't a lot of major news coming out of the show. There was, the most interesting thing for me was this SMI, the service mesh interface. And really behind that is Idiot Levine of Solo.io, which recently launched. Would you guys share that assessment, or is there other news?
Well, there was some other news from Google, and everybody made a tiny bit of news, but the SMI is probably the most interesting news. I know Sean disagrees with me.
Well, that's just because I'm a contrarian and I like disagreeing with everybody about everything. Otherwise, I wouldn't have anything to write about. SMI, I think, is moderately interesting. In the spirit of full disclosure, Microsoft did not talk to me. They talked to you. They didn't talk to me. They might have talked to you, and they didn't talk to you either.
Well,
they
talked to
him.
Frederic.
They say 1, 2, 3, 4.
And that's how it works in the press corps.
Yeah, exactly.
It's really
right.
it's all the same publication.
It's all the moving cards. But from my perspective, and I know you talked to them about this too, the omission of Google and IBM was interesting. I had interesting conversations with both afterwards. For me, I saw that as just competitive because they see Istio as being the leader for whatever reason. And then I had the good fortune, because I like to do a lot of these deep dive sessions here at KubeCon, CloudNativeCon, whatever they're calling it this year. And I was in a deep dive session on Kubernetes networking, and you would expect that something like Service Mesh would be directly integrated into Kubernetes networking. It's not, because Kubernetes has its own idea of networking. This idea of Service Mesh as a corollary might have interesting viewpoints. Some large platforms may use it, some may not, I don't know. But a core Kubernetes deployment today, my personal opinion, has no need for it.
Why?
Works just fine without it.
Just fine without it.
Just fine. It's an interesting add-on. It's like, do I really need air conditioning in my car? Well, if I live in Toronto, where I do, 2 months of the year. The rest of the year, I don't. You can do a lot of things. Some of these, like really large horizontal scale-outs, maybe. Some people say for complexity, maybe. But some of my background, I did a lot of networking stuff, and core networking, you can still scale really nicely. You don't necessarily need to have a mesh.
VMware is positioning itself as a networking company now. How would you then, and they're very interested in Service Mesh, so how would you assess that?
VMware is interested in being a market leader in whatever category is the next big thing, all right? VMware established its dominance in virtual networking with NSX, thanks to our good buddy Martin Casado. Martin, if you're watching, good job at Andreessen. Keep on investing. Make those good dollars, and I'd love to back you one day if I had my own venture capital.
Oh, yeah, there you go. We can talk about that later.
I don't. I haven't got
He's
that
a journalist. He has no money.
That kind of money. Who's gonna say, oh, they're not interested? Even when you talk to the Google and IBM guys, I talk to them too. They're not gonna say, oh, we don't care about.
So what was the biggest news?
For me, I'm not. See, I'm not really a trend guy necessarily. I like the little nuts and bolts.
So what were the nuts and bolts?
For me, the interesting part was some of the security conversations, and I know you had some too. Is that there's I hadn't realized that there was no threat model that had been done yet for Kubernetes proper, and that there is still. My professional opinion, and I'm not saying this to be extremely contrarian here, but just a little bit perhaps. But there are some large security concerns in Kubernetes that have still not been dealt with, in the sense that you put in code, and not every piece of code that go in is properly audited today, and that's the problem. You put in code, and not everything is understood whether or not it may or may not represent.
It's not being scanned.
You put in code, and not every project that connects to Kubernetes knows who you are. Like Google has this idea of zero trust, right? Beyond core. Kubernetes is the other way. We love everybody. Kumbaya, come in, plug in, you're accepted. So it's those kinds of things I had thought were solved issues, but when you get into the deep dive technicals kind of sessions, people are saying, yeah, not yet. It's coming, but not yet.
So Ron.
So I think he's not wrong, but
well, thank you. I don't mind arguing with you. We can arm wrestle if you want. It's early though.
Not wrong.
but You know, I was surprised. I was at the Aquasec Security pre-conference
great
thing
event.
where I saw Sean moderate a panel, and I was surprised to find out how wide open Kubernetes really can be and is by default, and it's by design, you know, to have that that built in to make it kind of easy to get a cluster up and running and all of that. But you know, as it becomes more mature, all of that stuff has to be locked down, and that's still, I think Sean's right, a work in progress. And that was one thing. But for US from a trend perspective, one of the things that I was thinking about as I've been here all week, and I'm actually working on an article on, is kind of the natural relationship between serverless and containers. And Sean's probably going to argue with me because that's what he does. But it seems to me that, you know, if you think about serverless as pure concept, maybe even separate from, you know, functions and triggers, the way that it's implemented today on the various clouds, that if you have, you know, this kind of abstracted resources, that would be a perfect kind of setup for something like containers, which are, you know, kind of going out, doing their thing. They need a certain set of resources, and, you know, then they go away. The problem is, as I've been learning over the last couple of weeks, because I've talked to a couple of startups that are trying to solve this problem, is that developers tend to over-provision because they're worried. They don't want their containers to blow up, right? So they say, okay, we're going to over-provision the number of resources we need, so just to make sure that we don't blow up. And they tend to way over-provision on the, you know, on the side of caution. That costs their companies money. And so into the void steps these companies that are saying, okay, we're going to help you provision just right. But, you know, it's sort of an autoscaler kind of thing. But, you know, if you think about it, if you take that one step further, if you could say, okay, you know, if the cloud provider was just simply taking care of that for you and saying, these are the exact amount of resources you need to run this job and no more, which is, you know, truly the promise of the cloud as it was defined to us a decade ago, right? Then that would be a perfect match. And as I've been asking the various large vendors I've spoken to this week, it seems like they recognize that too. And they each have like products in progress that are trying to address that.
So let's talk SMI then for a second. You and I kicked it over to Sean Michael.
Talk about more serverless. That would have been fun.
Serverless is fun, but no, I want to talk. To me, the thing that came up everywhere was service meshes. It was just one
Serverless,
of the,
yeah, that's what we said.
Yeah, sure, serverless. Yeah, serverless. No, but
A service mesh
did you notice that
showing up.
Linkerd was in the keynote, for example, right?
So
And
was
it wasn't-
Cryo, and Containerd wasn't. So
Right.
there's no, like, that's a, I don't want to get into the politics of the CNCF.
Why
because
not?
they've also-
No, that's what I want to get
That's
to.
what I want to get into.
Yeah.
Well, the CNCF is you know, politely invited us into this building, which they think. But Cryo,
So Canadian.
But it's not just
It is still
CNCF, but
politics.
it's also how the open source projects are getting managed these days.
sure.
Not just inside CNCF,
Okay.
but for example, Google with Knative and
Fair enough.
Istio.
There's to be fair, within the CNCF, there's always been competitive projects, and there's nothing wrong with that. There's Containerd, and then there is Rocket, which should be an
But look
addict
at the
product.
governance. Look at the governance
Yeah.
of these projects, and that's where it gets interesting.
Exactly, because Istio is not part of the CNCF
And it
after all.
likely never will be.
Yeah, exactly.
But what's interesting is they've never, to the best of my knowledge, and you know, people in the Twitterverse can correct me, they haven't even applied. They haven't even attempted that effort because it's still got to be closely held. Yeah, the governance, which makes sense. Meantime, there was a project that got put in April 9th, Network Service Mesh. That is actually kind of interesting. Led by Cisco folks, just for. There's the OSI networking stack, you know, layer 1 through 7, and they're doing the layer 1 through 3 stuff. So that's just how it connects. So instead of having a router, you're doing that more in software, kind of like a next generation software-defined networking thing. That actually is kind of interesting because then you're dealing with things like IP addresses, routing, DNS type things outside of a core DNS and scaling that. And that to me is interesting. This idea of all things to all people, that we can have this, what are they calling STO? A proxy sidecar. Like, what are you talking about?
Yeah, Frederic. I mean, what's your thought? I mean, because one of the things I saw was like, well, we sat down with William from Buoyant about Linkerd, and like, I mean, in my reflection, my past conversations with William, there's been, I think, this frustration where, you know, he was building Linkerd. He basically, you know, was committed to it, and along comes Istio, right? And like makes this big parade, right? And what I'm seeing from Linkerd at least is just focusing on its core, on its own core values. And William said it actually in an interview. He said, we just have decided to focus on what we're doing and doing it well. And I was actually very interested in that. And it shows to me that even though you can own these projects, right, that you do have to kind of focus on kind of what is that core value that you provide.
But that's very much the principle behind how the CNCF manages a lot of these projects, right? There's a lot of competition between them. Envoy is probably getting some of those features too, right? That are already in some of these service meshes. So they're perfectly fine with having these competing projects. Now, I had a chat with Craig McLuckie and Tim Hawkin from Google, who more or less founded Kubernetes with Joe Beda and Brendan Burns. And one of the things they said as far as setting up the CNCF a few years ago was that maybe one of the mistakes they made was to allow for these competing projects. But on the other hand, maybe that's exactly what allowed it to succeed, right? So
yeah, you have to have competition. Otherwise, first of all, these this type of event, there's a little bit of kumbaya on stage. Everybody loves each other. Reality is, most of these vendors are very aggressive competitors in the marketplace. There's only so much mind share. There's only so many dollars. Everybody's competing. I know we've been talking a little bit about service mesh, but I'll go back to that. Container D versus Cryo. Cryo is 1.0 now. It'll be in OpenShift 4.0, etc. Container D, like nobody today, except for maybe Red Hat internally, no one, 7,700 people here, no one is running Cryo as their core container runtime. They're running either Docker itself still because they had an older deployment, or Container D. There was no Container D people up on that stage. There was no mention of Container D in the Cryo keynote. It was offensive to me personally, and probably to a lot of people that spent the bulk of their days and nights working on that project. Right.
And one of the things that, to me, that speaks to this 5-year anniversary that there's a lot of ballyhoo here about. But to me, more Cryo represents that almost that low point in the community. It was just following the decision to really split from Docker in many ways, and to and Cryo, I think, was really the outcome of that, and the move away from Docker with Google involved as well in Red Hat. And so I think that's kind of that was a very pivotal point. And now Cryo's at 1.0, and if you look at kind of the history of Container D and then OCI, there was lots of back and forth between Solomon and Google, and Solomon was like putting his heels in, and he did not want to give. He wanted it just to be totally opinionated around Docker, and that's when the community essentially split, right?
Yeah.
But what I find interesting is, like, and I think this is a good point you bring up, is about Container D, is that was the pragmatic effort to try to heal kind of what had just happened to help move forward. Yeah. And Phil Estes of IBM worked very closely with the Docker team and then the CNCF to really shepherd this through. And I believe Container D does not get the status it deserves.
But if you look at what happened with Kubernetes, which is Kubernetes 1, right? And there were a bunch of orchestration tools that were out there. We were talking about this yesterday, and Kubernetes just kind of pulled ahead and became the choice. And I think we're probably going to find this to be the case with these other tools. But there's so many adjacent tools to this that all of these things, and we're really only 5 years in, which is really young, and all of these other tools have to kind of have that battle and have to figure out who's going to be the Kubernetes of service mesh, who's going to be the Kubernetes of runtime.
Yeah, is it going to be Google, IBM, Red Hat, or
but that's what people thought with Kubernetes, right? Yeah. But what was interesting to me was that, if you look at, I think it was last year, all of the big companies came into the CNCF. And they came into the CNCF because developers chose Kubernetes, right? They said, we want to use Kubernetes. And you can be sure that Red Hat and IBM and Google and Amazon and all of the big companies would have preferred to build their own orchestration layers. And they would have preferred that their orchestration layer either, be bound to their product or be the one that everybody uses. but they couldn't do it because they saw what was happening in the marketplace.
Yeah.
The marketplace of ideas won. And, sooner or later, that's going to happen with all of this other stuff, I think.
The other thing I'll just point out, though, because we're talking about competition, and since we might as well offend everybody equally, and we talked about Solomon, who's a great guy, and Solomon, keep on the traveling, and good luck with your son.
I'm not saying he was a great guy. I don't know if he's a great guy or not.
I'm a fan. All right, I was corresponded with him the other day actually, but. Regardless, what has happened with one vendor that may or may not involve people that wear hats that might be a color of the shade red is they have very strategically engaged in a process to remove the Docker bits, lowercase Docker, from anything related to containers. So they used to always say Docker up, Docker pull, Docker this. You go through OpenShift 4 and you'll see, well, there's Podman, there's Cryo, there's Scopia, there's all these things. Cryo, it's to essentially erase or remove some of that Docker legacy.
Yes.
Now, on the Kubernetes side, the same thing is happening because there's all those Google primitives, and there's still an effort, and I sat through more sessions than I care to count this week on that, where people are trying to remove some of those older Google ideas and Google dependencies and still make it more open, because there's still so much of the core Kubernetes build infrastructure, regardless of various announcements made at this conferences and otherwhere, that is still heavily dependent on Google and Google people. Of the what are we talking? 12 odd releases now of Kubernetes at this point. How many have been led by non-Google people? 4. So it's still early days, but it's that same process of removing from that progenitor so that it becomes more agnostic, as it were.
Yeah, but we're making it somewhat political. Isn't there like technical reasons too to kind of update?
There's a lot of technical reasons.
Yeah, to kind of get to the point after 5 years where we figure out how people are using these tools to bring them up to date.
And I think you make a good point, because I think that with Kubernetes, Docker was essentially kind of a container. It was a container technology. It was not an orchestration technology. The team at Google, led by Tim and Joe and Craig, they understood. We interviewed them as well, and they talked about kind of those beginning days.
Mm-hmm.
And there was Borg, and then there was Google Cloud, and I said, well, did you take anything from Borg? And they said no. They needed to treat it as a product.
Mm-hmm. Built it from
They
the ground
understood. They understood that there was actually a much greater need than just Docker as a container.
And let's not forget that the early reception of Kubernetes was not all positive either, and there was a lot of stuff missing early on. Sometimes on purpose, sometimes just because they didn't have time, because they built that tool within a couple of months.
Yeah, but
from the ground up.
Yeah, nobody. Well, in the modern world, waterfall development doesn't work. So Kubernetes is a fantastic example of really agile, fail fast, move forward, but not in the Zuckerberg kind of sense, but in a positive kind of way, right? Yeah. Like a continuous set of iterations.
Well, that's what you have to do with something like that.
You have to, because you never know. It's like the Mike Tyson quote, right? Everyone's got a plan until they get punched in the face. You get punched in the face. You got to get that in every interview. The Mike Tyson quote. Not that I'm a fan of Mike Tyson necessarily, but I'm a fan of the quote.
I'm waiting for his enterprise jokes.
Those are coming. But yeah, so.
Well, so the other top, so I'd like to get back to the security issue, because it still was a very big issue, I think, at this event. And I actually went to the Cloud Native Security Day for the session with GitLab, and that was actually the Cloud Native Security Day was sponsored by Twistlock, just for purposes of disclosure. They're a sponsor of the new stack, and the GitLab I thought had a really interesting presentation about this attack surface that we're starting to see really start to emerge, right? And I was looking at some of their points, and one of the things that they're saying is that, for example, in a cloud native environment, you have these different paths of attack, and then there's the different prevention capabilities that you can provide. And it goes through like vulnerable plugin allows remote code execution. You can have a lateral move to another pod. You can, other pods could talk to the API server.
Yeah,
you can go on and on and on and on.
We saw a similar demo.
Yeah.
And what this seems to be speaking to is this real kind of like unknown territory that we're still not, that most people are not really aware of. And that model of zero trust, really to focus on minimizing the risk, seems to be kind of going to be a really core subject, especially as these software supply chain security issues continue to surface, as you well know, with like the Docker hack, but also NPM like last year, which was even much bigger than the Docker attack.
Absolutely. In the spirit of full disclosure, Twistlock is not a sponsor of mine directly, but I did the opening panel for them at that same event. And on that opening panel, we had, because we wanted to do it on a standards kind of thing, because it is wide open, but there is also some discipline now that's happening from government grade organizations. So NIST, the National Institute for Science and Technology, we had the program director, a great guy whose last name I now forget, but his first name is Maruja. And there is a NIST document, a NIST special publication, NIST SP 800-190. I can link to that afterwards when you post this on the news stack. And it's a list of best practices, government grade, right? Because the United States government and other federal agencies within the government use containers and Kubernetes and various things, which can outline best practices and the like. Usually it's when you talk about best practices from a government perspective, it's always about reducing the attack surface, making sure that only the people that have the people that have privileges, they have the minimum required privileges. It's called the concept of least privileges. And then it's a process of continual audit. Because even if you do all the great things that the GitLab people talked about in their panel, even if you do everything that NIST tells you, even if you have the best security people in the world, even if you've spent X million dollars, there's still somebody who can do something, whether it's a nation state or otherwise, because nation state adversaries are very motivated, and with an infinite amount of resources and time, things can happen. So it's the bottom line, security. Security is not on by default in any of these things, which I think it should be. But even if it was, and that's what the GitLab people and NIST and other people in this conference and smarter people than me would ever always say, is you have to have security in depth or defense in depth, multiple layers. And that's the only way for any type of technology, containers or otherwise.
I saw the Aqua Security one, which is somewhat similar to what you're describing. And there was a gentleman, and I can't remember his name, but the consultant that went up there, and he started...
NCC Group.
Yeah, and he just started, and I'm not a coder, but, I could easily see what he was doing. Okay, I thought you were stopping me. Okay,
No more.
I guess,
No
I'm
mas.
not going to make my point.
Stop talking now.
All right, I'm sorry.
They are not a sponsor of the news stack. You cannot talk.
So I mean, this guy went through these motions of like opening up the cluster, and then doing all these kinds of adjacent moves, and he did it like with a couple of very quick, not sophisticated kinds of commands. It was just like, okay, I'm going to do this, like type, boom, opens up, and then I'm going to do this now that I'm in there. And it was a little shocking to me that it was that wide open, and but it's open by design. For whatever reason, they wanted to make it easy for developers to use, and they didn't want to put up a lot of roadblocks. And so that got me thinking that this is not unlike Amazon with leaving S3 buckets exposed by default, right, to the internet. And you saw, we see every few months, somebody's data is exposed because they didn't turn that toggle off. And finally, I think last year, Amazon finally put up a warning for developers because so many people were doing it that are you sure you want to leave this open? And some people do by design, but a lot of people don't because they just leave the defaults on because they don't know what all the toggles are. And my thinking was, and I've asked a bunch of people about that, at this conference, shouldn't there be a tool that kind of does that for Kubernetes? And the answer is, it's like there's not just one toggle. There's like so many configuration toggles. It's not a simple matter of saying, are you sure you want to do this? So, but at some point, I think, at the very least, there has to be a best practices scan. Like, are you sure, we went through it and these things are open. Is that really what you want to do?
Yeah, there's the CIS benchmark, the Computer Infrastructure Society or something. They do that. Aqua and Twistlock both have tools too. But yeah, you got to use tools, whatever they are, whether they exist today or they need to be created, because a regular human can't do it. That's the other theme I think that I got out of this conference was the extreme complexity of Kubernetes at this point, because it's just not like I thought that I was maybe I'm a smart guy some days of the week, not this early in the morning, but Yeah, it's ridiculous complexity. Nobody knows. Well,
That's-
few people know all the toggles, as it were.
That's what I was going to say, that it's really a sign of how there's room for the vendors here to improve the experience. And
Absolutely.
Which is, I was down on the floor quite a bit talking to the startups. Their security came up a lot. Storage was another issue that came up a lot.
Did state come up?
State and stateless.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
absolutely. So
Yeah.
that's all of those. I mean, it's great. It's a great thing about this community is that it opens up room for a lot of startups that can
which is also
really help
another
us, but-
interesting thing, because you know, sometimes you think open source, okay, great, that's the be all and end all, but the Eclipse model, and I don't hear people talk about Eclipse as much as they once did. I used to write and cover Eclipse very closely. I don't as much as I once did, as I said. But their early motto, and that was the Eclipse license also, which I guess the Apache license is what people are using now as the main thing for this, is you build that piece and then it's all that value on top. But nobody's going to use that plain base layer. And I think that's is happening with Kubernetes. I think it was, and I don't want to misquote somebody, so I'll say one of the SIG leads, and if I was in front of my terminal, I would double check who it was, berated people in the audience for using a .0 release of any Kubernetes release. So if it was 1.14 or 1.13, because the .0 is not production ready. You need other stuff, and that's where the vendors add value, whether it's security, the distribution vendors, the storage vendors, the visibility vendors, and then it becomes a whole a new stack, as it were, of infrastructure services.
Well, yeah, and we saw the other news piece was the combination of the two tracing projects,
Yes,
the Open Tracing and
Yeah.
Census.
Open Census, yeah.
Open
Census.
Census, right? That was the other piece there.
They
Because
merged, right?
they merged
Yeah.
into one because they were basically doing the same thing. But that's the other issue, kind of. If you're
The
talking about the complexity
visibility
of the stack,
Yeah.
then
Yeah.
you're suddenly
And
adding-
telemetry seems to be taking the center
telemetry
stage with
is
that.
exactly, yeah.
Yeah, well, the idea of consolidating projects also is a broader Linux Foundation kind of effort. They did that, and I know you cover everything related to Linux Foundation, but with LF networking, they did the same thing. They collapsed, and I know that there's been an effort to consolidate because there is a confusion. So the telemetry thing just is kind of those, why wasn't it that way in the first place?
Right.
But, you know, these things evolve organically, and you put it together.
But I get the sense that a third of the startups that are down on the show floor have some kind of monitoring tracing tool, right? That's
Right. Yeah, that's very much true. The other news that we were looking at, there's a project updates. Service mesh is a hot topic. Kubernetes. There was another news item that I was looking at. What is your guys' take on serverless these days? It seems like serverless is everywhere. We talked about Istio a little bit. We talked, about these kind of competing projects to some extent. Istio is service mesh. So, Knative did not really come up that much.
No, six months ago at the last KubeCon, it was all about the Knative, and there was almost no real news about Knative this time around. Though I did hear various conversations. It's still an emerging thing. I think. Personally, I'm a big fan of serverless for one reason. It's just the next step up in abstraction, because first you go from managing physical hardware to then managing virtual machines to then managing containers to then having the orchestration to then just thinking about it as a service. And as a line of business person, that's all you care about is your service event function. You don't care. But it's K-Move, yeah. That's a very interesting project.
Yeah.
So
from the
many little
Open
projects.
Maya
I didn't
guys.
keep
I
up with
spoke
them all.
I'm sorry, as I'm looking over
No,
that.
I was actually going to talk about that.
Because the idea to be able to move things is another story altogether. But yeah, serverless makes a lot of sense. For better or for worse, the reality is when I talk to actual companies doing anything, 99 out of 100 times it's Lambda and more Lambda. So
Right.
Knative is a wonderful idea. I think it's kind of like you have to have something competitive to Lambda, but will it displace Lambda as a mind share thing? No. As an option for those that aren't all in on AWS, probably.
I don't want to.
Yeah, go ahead.
I don't want to make everything about politics, but Knative too, not CNCF Google project.
Right.
Maybe that's the reason why it doesn't come up so much right now, because there seems to be a little bit more tension than there maybe was 6 months
And
ago.
if you look at the Knative community, right, it's the steering committee is all Google, and then the steering committee appoints the technical oversight committee, and
Which
that
means we could argue
and
it's really
that's
open
and that's
source,
Google, IBM, and Red Hat.
Yeah, I mean, if you look
Exactly.
at what Google announced at Cloud Next, I mean, there was Cloud Run, which is, a Knative product to try and bring, containers and serverless together. There was Anthos, which is kind of, a kind of overarching product to bring this whole cloud native ethos that you can move portability between clouds, or that you can do that, and they will provide the service for you. So it seems like Google is trying to suck in the energy of all this this kind of approach.
Yeah,
But just to
doing
go half a
open-
level up, though, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Alex, but there is a CNCF effort led by Chris Anistuck, Cloud Forms, Cloud something or the other, which is supposed to define the standards for interoperability, so you can have, whether it's Knative or OpenWhisk, which is probably not going to do as well as some of these other things over time, or Lambda, so that way you have a native language or way to have these functions and events that will be interoperable across different clouds. Because I think, we talk Knative, this, that, whatever, but there isn't that underlying primitive yet that defines that I can use this here, there, or whatever, because nobody wants to be, well, nobody. Companies don't want to be locked in. Vendors still want to lock in because that way they can still make their money,
Sure.
but that interoperability doesn't quite exist today.
To me, like Lambda or Azure Functions or whatever the competing products are, and I agree that Lambda is like if you are going serverless today, Lambda is probably the choice of most companies. But as I've thought about serverless, I kind of see it, that kind of functions model as being limiting. And I like the idea of serverless as a concept, that you're abstracting away that the developers don't have to worry about, infrastructure anymore. They don't have to worry about where it's going to go.
You have to worry about servers less.
Right.
That's how Kelsey Hightower described it.
Servers left.
That's
But
right.
in return, you have to worry about so many more other things.
Well, you
because
do.
Suddenly you have this Rube Goldberg machine of functions that
Yeah.
just.
One of the-
Well, that's
so
why.
complex it's
But
impossible
if you
to
took
manage.
away the concept of functions and you just had the concept of serverless, if there were a way to kind of extend that beyond functions, then you would have, just an abstract. You would have the cloud, as I said before, with the way we were taught about it, 10 years ago. You distribute what you need, and the cloud will scale it for you.
So
But that never really happened.
So you have a cloud foundry in a way. Is that what you're saying?
Well,
Right, because that
going
was the
back,
pro-
going
that
back
was the
to going back,
promise of
going back
that,
to
but yeah.
founding principles
There you go.
of the cloud. One of the core elements of cloud, as defined by NIST, is that it is utility computing, by the drink, right? But when we talk about running a virtual machine in the cloud, an EC2 instance, when we talk even about running Docker containers, it is not by the drink because you're running a long-running service. Serverless is, to your point, the true promise of the cloud because you are paying by the second by utility. One of the most interesting serverless things that I've ever written or heard about was a company, and we'll have to come back to what the name is, but basically what they were doing is taking WordPress, because many of us here use
Right.
WordPress to power our websites. WordPress uses a traditional LAMP stack, which is quite literally the definition of the old stack,
Right.
to power their stuff. But they've re-architected WordPress so that it could work on serverless, and found that instead of having all these long-running services, because you'd like to think you're getting hits on your site 24/7, you're not. So that you're only paying for
not.
what they-
We are.
Okay. All right. Well, I aspire to the greatness of TechCrunch and NewStack.
I know the
and
new
perhaps one day I'll
stack gets
have
a
it.
hit every second.
Well, sure. You get stacks every second. But meantime, do you really need to have that PHP server running 24 hours 7 at full concurrency and everything? No. So you pull it up and down. So serverless for a line of business person has the potential, and I say potential because I don't think it exists today, has the potential to dramatically reduce costs and then deliver on that definition of the cloud.
Yeah.
Right,
Why don't we
absolutely.
sum things up then from each of our points of view, looking forward and kind of assessing where we've come from over the past 6 months, year, or so on. So why don't you start, Sean?
I get to start.
Yeah.
Where we've come from. For me, I see little progress over the last 6 months is the truth. So things change a little bit, but the direction I see is more Kubernetes, more evolution, improved security we talked about, newer ideas, whether it's a service mesh and other things. We didn't talk about stateless stuff, but a better understanding of how stateless works, and then just general understanding of best practices. And I know we talked a little bit about that. So more of the same is what I'll expect to see 6 months out from now?
I mean, I think the companies that are here, both the startups and the established companies, have to continue to work to make this easier for mere mortal companies to use. Because I mean, when we were at that AquaSec event on Monday, there was one company there who was talking about how they had continuous delivery model that was 2 weeks of development and then 2 weeks of QA and security, and I'm thinking, that's not really continuous delivery. That's more like semi-waterfall. So, it's hard to do. It's hard to do, and it's still hard to do. And I think, over the next 6 months or a year, it's going to be up to the vendors to try and make this a lot easier to use.
Yeah, the complexity has just increased, it seems,
Yeah.
over the last year or so. While the technology is not stagnant, but I don't think we've seen like any breakthroughs really in the last couple of months.
Well, we talk Kubernetes, right? Because it goes alpha, beta, standard. So the stuff that's alpha, that's coming as general availability now, was identified as new a year ago.
Yeah,
But complexity is a good thing for vendors, though.
Sure.
So
the other thing is, I think we see a bit more focus on. I mean, I think the enterprise use cases are becoming a little bit clearer for Kubernetes, and we've got better Windows support, for example, right? Which is something we don't care about, but the big enterprises care about because they have to run their .NET workloads. What I expect to see, just away from the tech, is that we'll probably see a bit of a downturn as far as the startups go. I think we'll see some acquisitions. I don't think we'll see the same amount of vendors on the show floor, and maybe it'll be the same in San Diego because it's going to be a bigger show. But overall, I think we're going to get to that point that OpenStack was at maybe a few years ago, where that huge number of vendors is going to consolidate.
I think
hype cycle.
If you even look at
but yeah, for sure.
Copenhagen last year, I mean, they sort of set it up differently. They had the big vendors in one room, and they had what I call the interesting companies in the other room. And there were so many like Kubernetes as a service providers in that other room. And you're just not seeing that as many of those on the floor. I don't recall seeing that many at all in walking around.
No, it's not. There's not that many. I mean, there's plenty of startups. They all seem to be doing the same thing,
right?
In many ways.
Well, they're doing like niche stuff. They're not like trying
which means they're producing features so that will get bought by somebody like Oracle, which is really trying to make a push here. This the company, for example, and so I expect we'll just see.
Oracle buys everybody.
I was going to make some OpenStack jokes because we haven't talked about
think,
OpenStack, but it's everybody. It's come up in every conversation.
We've been going almost an hour, so I'm just going to kind of sum it up, and if you guys, then I'll just go around for a last word. But from my point of view, we haven't talked at all about Amazon Web Services. They were here. They had their own kind of event. I think the Kubernetes, the Kubernetes community, and AWS has had to recognize it. They've had to recognize open source, really, I think, for the first time. And you're seeing it kind of their participation here. The question is, how is their culture going to adopt to that upstream world where you have all these funky startups, you kind of have like the established kind of software providers who've already been there a while. How are they going to manage that? How is their culture going to really be able to, to change, to be able to adapt to that? That's one thing I'm looking at. IBM, we haven't talked much about. They've announced their own continuous delivery service, right? We've had this continuous delivery foundation, which we're still not seeing much from. It's really there's no agreement on the primitives. It's another kind of Google issue. I mean, I like to see them. I'd like to see what their priorities are, because what they're talking about is essentially kind of setting up the same kind of a model as we saw with with Kubernetes, but with continuous delivery. The other kind of topic, I think, is that the data security, portability, and this issue of state. And those to me are like the hard problems, the hard technical discussions. Even apart from service mesh, apart from serverless, those are the tough nuts to solve. And I kind of look to kind of who's really going to take the reins and become the startups that will kind of emerge out of this. And I count Portworx as one. And they're a sponsor, so I should just disclose that.
And I'll disclose I did a panel for Portworx too, so I'm a big fan of
You
it.
just
as
did
well.
panels for everybody.
Panels for
That's
everybody,
right.
so whatever. Yeah.
And
I have
I think the
nothing to
last
do
thing
with
I'd add
Portworx.
is I think the politics are going to have to be something we have to acknowledge and recognize.
true
And
in
all of us, I
everything.
think, should be covering it a lot more closely about the makeup and governance of these open source communities, because there's a lot of there's a lot of illusion out there.
There is.
And in the illusion, it's like, let's look behind the curtains to actually see what's there.
I probably do too much of that already, but and I get foundations in trouble because there's
Yes, you
obvious.
did. What did Dan say to you, by the way?
Yeah, so it's been a good week. It's been fun. We can talk about that off the camera.
Okay, great.
But just talking about continuous delivery, because that continuous delivery foundation should have, in another set of circumstances, become part of the open infrastructure, OpenStack Foundation.
It's still the OpenStack Foundation.
Right. The fact that it didn't goes to the point that they are, regardless of what they say, they are competing
Yep.
for groups. Period. Full stop.
Well, the CNCF says that, or at least said it to me.
Okay.
They are.
So your last final words?
Final words are: don't bet against Amazon, because Amazon. This is the only other story that I usually don't tell too much. The first time I spoke to Jeff Bezos, a long time ago, he won't talk to me anymore. He doesn't talk to regular folks like us anymore. Maybe he talks to you. You don't talk to me. Okay.
Talk to me.
Is I could never figure out why he wanted to call the company Amazon, and he said this story and other times too, because it's the river. Everything goes through it. It delivers, it takes, and it just flows. And that's why you can't bet against Amazon. You're not going to bet against a force of nature, because you will always lose. So regardless, Amazon is going to contribute. They're going to take. They're going to grow. They're going to flow. In the end, they're the big winner. And when you look at Kubernetes, Google invented it. Somebody can debate me on this, but there's more Kubernetes deployments in Amazon than anywhere else still. And the reason for that is because they're open. They're completely agnostic. They just want to be that flow, that everything can go through, make everybody happy, deliver what you need, whether it's some energy bars or a Kubernetes cloud. That's it.
Ron?
So I don't know about that, but I think that people are probably on Amazon because Amazon has 33% of the market share.
And same-day delivery.
But no, I'm talking about the cloud part of it. But
Same-day delivery, same thing.
What you brought up, Alex, I think is a really important element here, and it's the culture. And a lot of the people who are coming to these shows, and obviously it's gotten bigger and bigger as we've gone along, but a lot of the people that are still coming are developers, and we need to get the enterprises truly involved in this. And I think to get people to change completely the way they develop, so they're not doing like 2-week developments and 2-week QA and security like we heard at that event, you have to the vendors are going to have to kind of teach these people, these companies, a new way of doing this, and they have to get around all of the people in the company who have been, whose job is to say, no, you can't do that. We are the security people. We are the governance people. You can't do that because of all the things that Sean brought up earlier. And trying to get all that to work together is going to be the job of the vendors, and it's not going to be an easy job to do, because it's going to involve a complete cultural shift.
I'm just going to talk about Amazon for a second, because I think the culture is changing a little bit at Amazon and at AWS. We've seen it with Kata containers. They're kind of getting involved a little bit. I'm not saying they're doing
Firecracker.
A Firecracker, sorry, Firecracker. So we're seeing a little bit of a change there. They're here. They're here, but they're kind of not here because they're not on the show
really
floor.
quiet.
They've got like their own little garden outside here somewhere, right? So, but that's the
A
Amazon.
walled garden, you could say.
Well, it's got a glass wall at least around it. So it's. I think it's changing. I think it's changing very slowly because the culture is so ingrained in Amazon. I think they're getting that whole discussion around the licenses in the last few weeks and months has put a little bit of pressure on them, and I think it's just give it a few months. I think we'll see some changes at Amazon.
Right. I think kind of what I would just sum up as saying is I think the other kind of company that is interesting to watch right now is VMware with the acquisitions that they're making, and their rise in the
Certainly have to
their
tell 'em.
rise in the Kubernetes community.
Yeah.
They're number 2 or number 3 contributor now, depending on how you count it.
And if you look at the SIG release, the SIG I was maybe 10 different SIGs yesterday.
Yeah.
6 of them are led by VMware people,
Yeah.
so their role in governance and leadership is very impressive.
And you know, and they are they are emerging as a networking company, but they're also emerging as like a cloud native company, and it looks like they're starting to see the connection between the two.
Absolutely.
And so I would kind of see VMware's emergence kind of in the market. I think that'll continue to develop. And just in conclusion, VMware is a sponsor of the news time. So, but thank you all for
Hey,
participating.
thanks for having us.
This
Thanks
has
for
been a
having
lot of
us.
fun. This has
Long and
been
prosperous.
NewsTech analyst from KubeCon Barcelona. We'll be back again soon.